Let me introduce over here on my right-hand side, Ronnie Chan, who is the chairman of Hang Lung Properties, and I think rather usefully is going to bring a very clearly non-European perspective to what has happened in Ukraine over the last year or so. Next to Ronnie is Joschka Fischer, whom you met in the panel before Richard Branson. Joschka, of course, brings all his experience as a former foreign minister of Germany to this particular session. And on my left-hand side, with a rather magnificent piece of facial hair, which I hadn't seen before, and I'm recovering from the shock, Niall Ferguson, who I'm sure many of you will know because you've read his books, wonderful books on international history. He is the proud holder of the Laurence Tisch Professorship of History at Harvard University, the author of books, the maker of television documentaries, and a general soothsayer about international relations and international history. So welcome all three panelists. Yes, thank you. Why not? Give them a round of applause. Thank you. And do please keep coming in, those of you who are at the door. We want as many people to hear this as possible because I think it's going to be very interesting. Let's start, if we may, with you, Niall. I want you just to give me a sense of where you think the Ukraine crisis has left our thinking and our assumptions about the key institution, the sort of building blocks of international geopolitics, thinking of NATO, the European Union, maybe even the United Nations as well. What has happened over the last 6 months in Ukraine that has affected your thinking about the workings of those institutions?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here, albeit not in the right location, since this time last year, we were discussing these questions in Yalta. And I'm sure other participants prior to my arrival have remarked on just how dramatically the situation has changed in the 12 months since then. At that time, I left Yalta convinced that Ukraine's membership, or at least association with the European Union, was a done deal, and that the Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski's exhortation to Ukraine to be like us was going to be followed. If one now looks back and asks what went wrong, I think it's extremely important to avoid simplistic blame attribution. I think much went wrong on the European side. There was complacency on the part of the EU, and perhaps a fundamental failure to understand the geopolitical threat as it was perceived by the Russian president. I have just been reading Henry Kissinger's new book, World Order, and perhaps if we say loudly enough that I'm about to define the new world order, people will come in from outside.
Well, if they don't, we are going to have something very special which they don't have, so carry on regardless.
The critical point that has been central to Kissinger's work is the difficulty that different cultures have in understanding one another's strategic framework, because strategic frameworks are historically defined. The world order that arose after World War II was a synthesis, Kissinger argues, between a European balance of power framework dating back to the Treaty of Westphalia and an American idealist framework which we would probably associate with Woodrow Wilson. That synthesis of idealism and realism prevailed in the Cold War, but since the Cold War, we have entered a period of considerable disorder because not all of the world's civilizations accept the premises of the Atlantic or Western world order. In the Islamic world, in the East Asian world, and it may also be argued in the world of Russia, there is a different conception of order. And I think the fundamental problem was that the Europeans and Americans could not see how the Ukrainian association with the EU looked to Moscow. Now, to avoid an excessively long answer, let me come to the point. If you had told me 12 months ago that there was going to be the annexation of Crimea, where this conference had taken place, that a sovereign state, which had in fact its territorial integrity guaranteed by an international treaty, was going to suffer a loss of territory as a result of force, I would have been aghast. It happened, and making it unhappen is going to be extraordinarily difficult. But what we cannot do is simplify this crisis into a simple goodies and baddies story in which the Russian president is simply the villain of the piece and the Europeans are the noble heroes. In many ways, Europe blew it.
Joschka, go on, just don't hold back. Respond to what Niall's just said.
I've just the opposite position. Because, yes, Europe made mistakes. But think about, theoretically, that Europe wouldn't have acted towards Ukraine. Would have that changed Putin's strategy? My answer is no. Putin reacted on the Maidan, not on the Europeans. Because he thought, together with Yanukovych, he has made it. Ukraine is back under the umbrella of Russia. And it was the Maidan, not Europe, who challenged Putin and Yanukovych. That's the problem. So there were mistakes. The Europeans were naive. They had no strategic concept. They had no, from my point of view, also a lack of strategic vision, because it's not up to the EU. Putin took the Europeans more serious than the Europeans took themselves. That's highly ironic, because the Europeans thought with good intentions, this is a trade agreement, why not? And the trade agreement was thought not to bring Ukraine to Europe, but to keep Ukraine at bay from Europe. Just the opposite.
May I add a very short rejoinder to that?
Go on, very short, because then I want to bring Ronnie in.
It's really important. I don't actually think we disagree. It's just that I think having no strategic concept is no small failure. It's a disastrous failure. And by the way, not only did the Europeans have no strategic concept, the Americans had no strategic concept. This would not have happened if Barack Obama had not gone on television in September of last year to say that the United States was no longer the global policeman. That was over Syria. The red line turned out to be a pink dotted line, and the Russians drew their own conclusions. The strategic failure has not just been a European one, it has also been an American one. I don't think it is a light mistake to have no strategic concept. The president said just 2 weeks ago, we have no strategy for Syria. Having no strategy is the worst possible thing a major international organization can do.
But even if Obama had claimed to have a strategy, Putin, if we're talking Russia rather than Syria, Putin may well have called his bluff, because Putin, I believe, felt that he held the cards and probably feels justified.
But we are talking about two different issues. The one thing is the one thing is the reaction of the United States. The other thing is the European Union. The European Union is not a superpower. Is not the leading power of the world. I think it's different with the United States.
Well, that's a very interesting point, Joschka, and I want to come back to what the European Union actually is, particularly to those countries who aren't in it, who might want to be in it, or to those countries who neighbour it. But before we get to that, I actually want to bring Ronnie in, because, Ronnie, I think we do need a perspective that is far from Europe on the sort of the message that comes out of the Ukraine crisis in terms of the geopolitics of it, the alliances, the shifting notion of blocks and power structures in the world. You look at it from Asia, obviously, and I just wonder whether, when Niall talks about those parts of the world where European assumptions about freedom and democracy do not apply, whether that means that from your Asia perspective, what has happened is entirely sort of understandable, pragmatic politics from Russia's point of view, and is that the way that it's seen in Asia?
Steve, I'm going to offend everybody. I'm going to present something that is neither the European balance of power nor the American self-imposed value. I think Asia presents a totally different philosophical origin of another way of looking at the world. I believe that in terms of institutions, Asia in general has much to learn from the West. But philosophically, I believe the West has gotten itself into a cul-de-sac. To go back to Niall's point about Kissinger's book, Europe is balance of power. That means a little bit you, more of me, hopefully. Of course, we know that. Of course, wars, of course, we know that. So it's either you or me. Both of us have to give a little, and we take a little. Hopefully, I take more than I give. America says, I am the incarnation of righteousness. I represent the universal value. And hence, it's me and none of you. The Asians, which, like it or not, is basically rooted in the Chinese philosophy, says that we are all one. And hence, let's learn to live together by compromising, not in the European way of the 19th century, where you have alliances formed. Nor are they saying, I am it, like the Americans say. But the Chinese is the yin and the yang. Sometimes there's more yin, sometimes more yang. The other times, you have to balance things. If you have too much yang, you need a little bit more yin. You follow that. And so I think that the way the West have been looking at the world for the last 200 years has gotten us to a mess situation. Not that the Asians have a solution, but all I'm saying is, while Asians need to learn much from the West, such as rule of law, such as participative politics, we have to learn a lot in terms of structure, in terms of institutions. But philosophically, I believe the Asians, in particular the Chinese, present a totally new way of looking at the world, where it's a little vague. I suppose the British knows it a little bit. Americans always think that I am the incarnation of righteousness, and hence I'm always right. And hence, the world is going to be a problem. You know, this year is 2014. It reminds me of 1914, when there were shifting alliances. You have the Central Power, you have the Allies, and then you have people that go back and forth like the Italian. And today, if we're still in that mindset, I think we're not going to solve the world's problem. There are times when some people would cross the line. Perhaps Russia has done that. I will leave you Europeans to figure that out now. That
well, no, with the greatest respect, Ronnie, I don't want you to leave it to others to. I want you to tell me whether you, from your perspective, think a line was crossed. You know, because I'm fascinated by your exposition on the different sort of philosophical approach in Asia, but the bottom line is you've got to address real-world problems. And the real-world problem in the last year is that Ukraine's sovereignty has been undermined, an international border has been crossed, international treaties have been torn up, and I just want to know, from your point of view, and the way the real world works, you know, would you and would most countries in Asia say, you know what, the reality is Russia's a very big country, Ukraine's a relatively weak neighbor, and Putin has exploited a pragmatic situation? Or would you, like so many voices in Europe and the United States, say, no, something profound and fundamental about the international system has been breached here, and we have to make a stand?
Isn't it true, Stephen, that it's obvious that you are a Westerner? So you see things in a very black and white way. Right, wrong, black, white, heaven, hell. Whereas the Asians don't look at it that way. It's a philosophical difference. And hence, in order to, before we get to the point where we are today, there's a lot of other things that ought to have been done, but that's water under the bridge. From here on out, does it have to be you or me, Russia or Ukraine? Are there ways that the international community can work together? Even, say for example, your legal tradition says that always have a winner or a loser in a law court. But nowadays you're figuring out that mediation is perhaps a better way many times, where you win 60%, I win 40%. So as a result, I give you 20%, or whatever the differential is. Instead of always, and that's, I have a problem with your program, by the way, Steve, on is it BBC? Right, it's always black and white. And you force a solution, force somebody to take a position, and the world will be very bad if everything is black and white. And if programs like yours keep forcing people to take sides, either you're with me or you're against me, the world will be pretty darn bad. So perhaps a page from the Asian philosophy will help a little.
All right, well, you both wanted to respond. So, Niall, you have a go first.
I have the utmost respect for Sir Ronnie, especially since he and his brothers have just given my university the largest ever donation in its history. So I have to watch very carefully what I say in respectfully disagreeing with him.
I can't take it back.
Yeah, well, let's forget that bit of soft power and just say what you really think.
I just make sure that Larry Summers is no longer the president when I give it. No, I'm kidding.
When one hears these arguments about a fundamentally different Asian philosophy of power, it's very seductive. It's just that when one actually goes to East Asia, one encounters realpolitik in action and fairly classical diplomatic and even military interaction between great powers. Think only of the relationship now between China and its neighbors on a whole variety of territorial disputes. So I'm a little skeptical about the idea that there is a kind of yin and yang solution to the Ukrainian problem. Let me illustrate the point with a brief anecdote. At the time when the escalation was occurring and Crimea had just been annexed, I was in Beijing. And two things struck me. That from the vantage point of the Chinese media, there was a great deal of sympathy for the Russian position. It was striking to me how pro-Russian the coverage was. The other thing that struck me was that when one talked to people in power in Beijing, their view was this: excellent. The Russians are in a really weak position now. We've got them on the gas deal. And sure enough, that was exactly the reality. The Chinese understood better than the Europeans or the Americans that Putin's position was weak, that he was trying to salvage a wreck, which was the wreck of the Yanukovych regime. His position was far weaker than anybody in the West appeared to appreciate. But the Chinese got it, because when all is said and done, and after all the yin and yang, they may be better students of realpolitik, of power politics, than we are.
But it's interesting. Well, Joschka, you go, and then I'm going to turn a corner in the debate. But you quickly pick up as well on what Ronnie said, and then we'll turn this corner.
Ronnie, I don't believe when we look to the East China Sea or the South China Sea, when we look to East Asia, when we ask the question that this will be done according to yin and yang. No, it's pure power politics. If you will ask a Vietnamese whether he has hopes in the Asian philosophy in dealing with the ambitions of China or the other way around, the answer will be no. They are completely on the old European track. And if you would ask me, what is the most dangerous region beyond direct confrontation like here in eastern Ukraine? It's East Asia. Why? Because there is a lack of tradition of modern diplomacy where you are bringing together all the actors. There's a lack of multinational institutions. Multinationality is not the strong side of the yin and yang. And therefore, if you would ask me, where's the biggest strategic risk? I would say East Asia. You have Japan, you have the regional risks, China, his ambitions on the rise, all nuclear powers, the craziness on the in North Korea. So if you put all these pieces together, you can see this is the region which is closer to Europe 1914 than any other region in the world. But nuclearized, yeah, well, that's the big problem.
Well,
and America is playing there a balancing role. if you would think about East Asia without the presence of the United States, with its security guarantees, I think there would be the imminent risk of a big war.
Well, Joschka, that's disturbing and interesting, but I don't want to go too far down that track, because I want to bring it back, actually, to lessons learned from Ukraine and what it tells us about the state of multilateral institutions and geopolitics. You, Niall, seem to be saying that if only Washington and Brussels, the European Union, had had a clear strategy in the months preceding the Ukraine crisis, none of this would have happened. I find that a little hard to believe, and I'll tell you why. I mean, it seems to me that if I were Ukrainian today, I would be really wondering about how much faith to put in the power and indispensability of partnership with Washington, for example, and indeed in the power and reliability of European partners as well. And this isn't just short-term, this is sort of long-term. You know, there is an idea abroad that may have some real merit to it, that the United States is no longer capable or interested in projecting its power in ways it has done in even the recent past. And the European Union as well, in so many ways, is a fading power, economically, demographically, many different ways.
Well, I agree with Joschka Fischer that the European Union is not yet capable of being a military power, and indeed its demilitarization at the national level is one of the problems that we face today. But the crux of the matter is unquestionably the United States. The United States could quite easily have taken military measures to discourage the Russians as soon as it became apparent that a game was on with respect to Crimea. There were options in the Black Sea, naval options, that were not exercised. There were options involving NATO that the president chose not to take. He had choices, and yet again, once again in his presidency, he took the line of least resistance, and it had the worst possible outcome. Because it seems to me that by allowing Crimea to be annexed and the Treaty of Budapest to be rendered worthless, the president has sent another signal to the world, comparable with the Syrian signal, that the United States may have the capability but does not have the will. He's having to now row back in the Middle East, do a complete U-turn on Syria and Iraq in a most spectacular way, which, by the way, vindicates those of us who criticized his foreign policy 2 years ago. He will presumably, at some point, have to do some kind of U-turn with respect to Eastern Europe.
But you only take those measures. I don't quite know what you're talking about, specific measures in the Black Sea, but you only take measures like that, presumably deploying warships, if you are prepared to use them. Are you seriously suggesting...
I'm trying to make, Stephen, the point that Russia's position was really weak, and we took no advantage of that.
But it was, you know, it wasn't weak in one fundamental way. Russia happens to be a bloody great big country that neighbors Ukraine, and has overwhelming military force which it can project very easily into Ukraine. That is a massive advantage that Putin has and will always have, and the West knows that.
No, I would defer here to the military experts, Wes Clark, who's with us, but it seems to me clear that by taking no military options, by exclusively focusing on economic sanctions, President Obama ensured that Putin had a free run at what amounted to an invasion of eastern Ukraine. And I do not think that the Russians would have dared do that if there had been even the slightest possibility of American military or NATO military action.
What would the Europeans have made of a different... I can't even imagine a Barack Obama in the place that Niall says he should have been.
Well, he's doing airstrikes in Iraq, for God's sake. I mean, this man can do 180-degree turns.
Yeah, well, okay, that's true. But, you know, Obama's entire premise for winning office was getting America out of overseas entanglement.
And that turned out really well, didn't it?
Sure,
it's been
but
a brilliant
I'm just telling
success.
you the way the man won 2 elections. So, you know, if democracy counts for anything and the mood of the American people counts for anything...
You know, Stephen, the mood of the American people has changed. It has changed dramatically in the course of this summer. Mark my words, although people said they wanted to retreat from American engagements overseas, once Americans saw what that meant in practice, which was humiliation and then even the decapitation of American citizens, believe me, the mood changed. The mood has changed in Washington. People realize the Obama option of the touchy-feely America led to scenarios like Ukraine, to Syria, to ISIS. The failure of his strategy is now transparently clear. And that's why even he, with 2 more years still in office, has to address the question of power. The key here is, how do we exploit the relative weakness of Russia's position to arrive at a stable situation with respect to this country? There's not a 60-40% option on the table here. We can't, it seems to me, in all conscience, as Europeans, knowing what we do about the history of Europe, remembering what happened to this city in the early 1940s, say, it's okay, you can have 40% of Ukraine's territory, just don't send any more tanks. That would be a catastrophic return to the policies of the 1930s. We can't let that happen.
All right, let's hear from Joschka then.
Listen to you folks. I start to admire again active politicians, how careful they calibrate strategies and how careful they are with implementation. Because, I mean, we have to understand that America and Europe were living in post-Cold War illusions, as we know it now. Nobody knew that beforehand. We know it now. But that's a matter of fact. And a democracy, once it used to a certain illusion, peace dividend or withdrawal or whatever, it's not so easy to bring them back, to bring them around. That's the way of democracy. And you mentioned rightly that in the short term, Russia has the benefit of the short line with Ukraine and all the consequences this will have. But I agree with Niall in the middle term perspective. I think Putin made a big mistake strategically. You could see that in the negotiations with the Chinese. The Chinese knew perfectly well that Russia is extremely weak. They had only one goal in the negotiations with Russia: to get a cheaper price than the Europeans are paying. This was the goal. And the signature ceremony was delayed because it was not reached. So they said in cold blood, we are not signing now. We are signing when we reach that agreement. So from that point of view, I think Niall hit the nail at the top, that if Russia thinks to modernize with China, it will end up in a sellout of Russian interests.
Well,
that's my firm conviction.
Yeah, I mean, I love Niall because he's so clear in what he believes Washington should be about and should have done, and the leadership that has been lacking. But I can't help thinking that the last time Washington gave a clear foreign policy lead, you know, was frankly 02, 03, the Iraq War. George Bush had absolute clarity about what it was about.
The worst example you can choose.
No, but that's the point in a way. You know, Europe fell out big time with a United States which was led from the top decisively and had a clear agenda and clear objectives. Imagine an Obama who had reacted the way Niall thinks he should have reacted to this burgeoning crisis in Ukraine. Really, what would Europe have done? What does Europe want to be? Does it want to be a partner in military terms with the United States, projecting power? Or does it really just want to be an economic bloc with lots of sort of soft power apparatus around it? You tell me.
That's not an alternative. If you look today to how you define power, it's not an alternative between soft and hard power. Yes, Europe must get stronger in the hard power sector. That's my firm conviction. But on the other side, the soft power is extremely important. Hard power is not the currency for power in the 21st century. It's the economy, it's the culture, it's whatever. And let's go back to China. China has also a strong soft power element, which is not so seen in the West, but in Asia and in Africa, it's there. And therefore, I think it's not an alternative. The Europeans have a deficit in hard power, yes. And looking to the world, I think Europe has to invest in increase its hard power, because America will not be there anytime when Europe needs America. And we see the threat for the Ukraine is not only a threat for the Ukraine, but for the European state order.
One more question to Ronnie, then I'm going to open it up to questions, because I'm very aware, you know, here are four guys pontificating, and none of us are Ukrainian, but we're talking about how, in a sense, how Ukraine should see the wider world going forward. And I'm interested to get some Ukrainian perspectives on that, as well as anybody else who wants to take part. But the final thing from you, Ronnie, before we do that,
allow me one more sentence. And one consequence very easily to draw, Britain should give up for the time being, leaving the European Union. This would be very important. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
you don't want to go down that road because
I will.
the conversation would get so sidetracked and it would get, well...
Keep
not
Scotland at
even
stay.
mentioning Scotland. No, let's not go there. Ronnie, if the United States had projected muscle and power in a different way toward Putin at the beginning of this crisis, Niall says it wouldn't have unfolded the way it did. How would China have reacted, do you think?
You use the right word. How would China react? China would not do anything proactive. Not just because geographically it's far away, but it's really its own perception of itself in the world. It will just react. It will react according to, let it be. What else can China do? But let me say this. The question I have for you, ladies and gentlemen, by the way, it's only 3 of them pontificating about Ukraine, not this one, okay? The Chinese don't want to pontificate on anything. And frankly, most of the time, they don't qualify. But my question to you, gentlemen, is where do you want China, what role do you want China to play? Like it or not, China is going to be a force. Economically and increasingly politically and maybe even, General Clark, militarily. So what role do you want them to play? Do you want them to be your problem? Do you want them to be your friend? And I tell my American friends, I say, hey, wait a second. You have to make up your mind whether Russia is your big potential problem or is China your big problem. And by the way, don't say yin-yang doesn't work. Henry Kissinger keeps saying that for 3,000 years, East Asia, with a dominant power, size matters, okay, called China, has had a much more peaceful history for 3,000 years than Europe has ever had. And so don't assume that it doesn't work. I set you another example. You mentioned about the South China Sea and the islands and so forth. Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leaders for the last 60 years decided with the Japanese, we're not going to agree on this thing. If I agree to give it up, my people would kick me out. If you agree, your people will kick you out. So let's just leave it there. Just leave it there. Don't touch it. Certain things, it's smarter not to touch it. And yet, in this case, somebody in this case Japan, unilaterally changed the equation and nationalized it. That's another issue. But China, in Asia in general, having been on the wane for the last 300 years, have no choice but to play by the Western rules. But if all you West in the West, sorry to say this, are so proud to think that just because you have been strong for the last 300 years, forgetting the last 3,000 years of history, then perhaps there's no solution. That perhaps you should be a little open-minded. Don't just throw it out and say there's no yin and yang, right? China and Japan decided for 60 years not to touch that issue. And it was peaceful for all those years. Now, obviously, China, they have to learn to play by the Western game because the West dominates, like it or not, in the world today, economically, militarily, politically. So when it's chance, hey, they've been negotiating with Russia for 15 years that I know of on the gas deal. Hey, if China doesn't know how to take advantage of a situation that you guys, a mess that you guys create, China is stupid. And the Chinese are not that stupid, right? So they have to learn to play your game. I just hope that you all will have a little humility that perhaps there's another totally different way of looking at international relations. After all, as Henry Kissinger also said, it is not self-evident that the Western system will always work in every part of the world. And you have a big part of the world with 40% of the world's population, 60% of the world's population if you count South India, that have been at peace for 3,000 years.
I agree it is absolutely not self-evident, but as it stands right now, Ukraine is in a position where it is looking westward for its immediate support. You know, it's looking to the European Union, obviously it's looking to Washington, it's looking to NATO as well. So I want to open this up now and get your input into where you see the meaningful alliances for Ukraine, what you draw from this crisis about the strength of different Western institutions, and whether you, like Ronnie, think that actually a Western paradigm imposed on what is happening in the world today can actually be counterproductive. So I'm opening it up. You've got 3 great panelists to quiz or give your thoughts to, and I'll start with you at the back, sir. Just hang on for a microphone. Just give us your name and your question stroke thought.
My name is Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform in London. There's been a lot of talk about Henry Kissinger's book, which I haven't read yet. He believes in spheres of influence, not particularly interested in human rights. Is Ronnie arguing, and is possibly Niall arguing, I don't know, that Russia and China, because they're big and powerful, should be allowed to establish spheres of influence in their neighbourhood, and smaller countries should accept a kind of tributary system, as was the case in previous centuries, and it's just too bad if they're small, because as Ronnie says, size is important, size is right.
Yeah, Charles, that's a great question. I was striving to ask that sort of question, but didn't put it half as well as you. So both of you have a very quick crack at it. Ronnie first.
I am 5'3". I am born small. Ever since I was a kid, I know my place in the world. There are certain things you don't do. You do it, there are consequences. I was talking to Senator J. Rockefeller recently, and he said that at the end of the day, the world is tribal. He has a lot of points to it. And if so, then sphere of influence is perhaps inevitable. It is nice to say that all are equal. All are created equal. I am short and ugly. It is not equal. So, like, the only thing is the Chinese believe its political philosophy, or indeed its social philosophy, is the key word to the Chinese philosophy is benevolence. They believe, sort of like Plato does, that a king should be a philosophy king. To the Chinese, the king ought to be a moral, benevolent leader. So the question is not whether you have spheres of influence. The question is whether the center of the spheres of influence, each one of them, are benevolent. And for that, you need international rules, I agree. You need international laws in order to govern that. And that's why I said whether Russia has crossed the line or not is up to you Europeans to decide.
A lot of time talking about Henry Kissinger. Is Russia's sphere of influence a concept that he would apply to what has happened in the last year?
In the new book, World Order, Charles, which I've just read, his argument is really more about differing conceptions of regional order rather than spheres of influence. And the critical point he makes at the end of the book is that the world needs a Treaty of Westphalia, a new kind of balance of power between these regional civilizational powers. It's actually an argument quite close to Samuel Huntington's, if you think back to the post-Cold War classic Clash of Civilizations. Now, the critical question for Kissinger is the US-China relationship. Remember, Ronnie, in his last book, he ends by warning of a 1914 scenario between the US and China. So there's a sense in which his great fear has always been another 1914. The crucial question in his mind, and in mine too, is what does the United States do about the rise of China? Does it try to contain it by making friends with absolutely everybody else in the region, which I guess was the thrust of President Obama's recent Asia trip? Or does it accommodate and work in some kind of co-evolutionary way with China, which seems to me the better strategy? The critical point for this audience is that if the United States follows the Kissinger line and works towards a kind of G2, or Chimerica as I would call it, partnership between the US and the PRC, that has quite worrying implications for the whole of Europe, West and East, because it's not at all clear that in such a partnership there would be an immense American or Chinese interest in intervening one way or the other in a European crisis. And so, in effect, Russia would be given something of a free hand.
Right, so all the guff about defending freedom and democracy would just be so much hot air.
Well, part of Kissinger's career has been trying to explain to Americans the limits of foreign policy with respect to the human rights of people in foreign countries.
How delicately put. Right, let's get back to questions. Sorry? Yeah, all right. I did say, what about Ukraine? I guess you're Ukrainian, so go on then.
Okay,
give us your name and your question.
Thank you very much. I'm Alexei Garany from Kiev, and as a professor of comparative politics, I know about problems of separatism in China, in India, and I know how China suffered from foreign aggression in the modern history. So frankly speaking, I was surprised by Chinese-Indian position in the United Nations when they didn't support a very simple and obvious thing, territorial integrity of another country. And I believe, I'm fascinated by discussion of Asian philosophy, but I believe that sometimes there are black and white things, and we should call aggressor as aggressor.
Yeah.
Well,
that was what I was trying to say to you, Ronnie, about you know, lines being crossed, sovereignty being undermined, invading armies being sent across international borders. Why would China not sign up to that pretty simple condemnation at the United Nations?
Very simple. China has their problems. If you cannot think put yourself in somebody else's position and think on behalf of him or her, you have a problem. China, for example, as I said this morning, has energy security problems. Where does China get its energy? In the last 10, 12 years, China's energy dependency from overseas has gone from something like 1 to 2% to now 17, 18% perhaps, or whatever the number is. And the projection is horrific. And so, with the United States blockading China everywhere, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, everywhere, is America a reliable friend? As long as it is within limits, sure, they have to work with America, but America is big and tall. But on the other hand, if it doesn't have the other alternative in its pocket, then they are stupid. Where can they buy energy?
Yeah,
Iran,
but hang on.
Russia?
Yeah, but you're just, because I want to get a couple more questions and we're out of time. You're just saying there's no room for principle whatsoever. You know, fundamental principles, you're saying forget about it. There's no room for that sort of nonsense.
When you don't have food and when do you have energy? Let me tell you, West have been wealthy too long. You guys have forgotten what it is to not have food and not have energy.
All right, well, I guess
when it comes to existential issues.
Okay. All right.
I would say Ukrainians, Ronnie, with all due respect, have still very vivid memories indeed of what it is to be hungry and what it is to be oppressed. That's not so very far back.
I'm talking about the West. I'm talking about the West.
Yeah, we're going to be out of time any moment now. So, ma'am, give us your thought or question. The microphone's right there for you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Sandra Kalniete. I'm a member of European Parliament and I represent Latvia, one of these marginal countries which never asks somebody to invade our territory. And there are many countries like mine. And then I'm listening, gentlemen, to you representing European superpower Germany, Asian superpower China, and you, academic world of another superpower, close friend to us. I'm wondering where in that future will be place for countries like ours, which are between different spheres of influence. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Joschka.
For Europe, it would be absolutely devastating if we would go back to zone of influence. Take, for example, what is the zone of influence of Russia? The former borders of the Soviet Union or the former borders of the Warsaw Pact? What is the zone of influence? Who is deciding about that? Brute force. And this would create havoc in Europe. Impossible to go back. This would destroy all the progress we have made since the Second World War.
Well, obviously that...
Joschka, surely the lesson is that if we are, as Europeans, and I'm a British citizen, if we are to defend the small countries, and there are 12 EU member states with a population of less than 6 million. Scotland wants to be the 13th, by the way. If these little countries are to be secure, then Europeans in the big countries have to learn that you have to back up your soft power with hard power. And with all due respect, Joschka, your party stood for the very opposite position for years, that hard power, including nuclear weapons, was unacceptable. Europe has disarmed on your watch. Germany may be an economic superpower, though I'm not sure for how much longer, but militarily, you don't count, and Putin's not afraid of you. And until he's afraid of you, the sphere of influence option is open to Russia. It's time West Europeans got real about that.
Yeah, but Neil, it's obvious. If you look to Luxembourg, for example, overrun twice by Germany, destroyed by the 2 world wars, is today one of the wealthiest states in Europe, and it thanks to the European Union, where the smaller countries
thanks
have
to
their
NATO.
guarantees.
Thanks to NATO.
But
I
want to get one more
about
The
why
wealth is
Western
based
Europe
on the
was safe in
European
the Cold
Union.
War.
Sorry.
Just one thought I would throw out, and you know, you're so adamant, Neil, that things could be different if only people would project hard power. What about Crimea? I mean, you said, you know, we have to now think about how to make things unhappen. Let's be honest. Does anybody in this room really think that Russia's control of Crimea, the annexation, can be made to unhappen? However many threats are issued, however much military power is brought to bear.
I think it must be made to unhappen. But we've made it much, much more difficult for ourselves by letting it happen. That is my point.
And what's your time frame for making it unhappen?
Well, it's hardly going to be measured in days or weeks,
No,
Stephen,
well,
is it?
quite.
When Western Europe has effectively disarmed itself and the President of the United States is terrified of using his great military power. But if we do not aim at that, if we do not aim at restoring the territorial integrity of the Ukraine and reversing this act of aggression, then we will have sold the pass. We will have thrown away the achievements of which you're so proud, Joschka. And that is what's so terrifying about what has happened in the last 12 months.
All right, I'm afraid I'm going to have to say this is the last question, but sir, you've been incredibly patient, so you get it.
Okay, Alexander Chally, the former First Deputy Minister of Ukraine, and I have a very practical question. Ukraine in our history till now have a security alliance, Budapest Memorandum. I was a person with President Kuchma on podium in Budapest together with Clinton, Major, who helped to put signature under this document. I was a person who received cable from your leader of China in my file that you keep the same obligations, and from President of France. I have a question to you. What do you think? It's a real document now or no? My first question. My second question, if no, what the influence that 5 members of Security Council of United Nations, 5 nuclear countries, refused to keep their obligations? And my third question, what do you think about General Smishko appeal and the leader of Russian opposition, Mr. Nemtsov appeal, that Ukraine has to restore its nuclear status? And for us, it's very easy to do, be sure.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to be quick. So, is that Budapest, I don't know if we call it a treaty or a memorandum agreement, whatever we call it, you know, where all the big powers signed up to pretty much guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity, that counted for nothing. So is that dead? Does it have any meaning at all?
It's a dead letter if we don't ever attempt to enforce it. And if it is a dead letter, then I would hardly blame Ukraine for considering, once again, all of its military options. The worst consequence of weakness by the Western powers is nuclear proliferation. Look at the Middle East, look at East Asia, and if we see it happen now in Central and Eastern Europe, we will only have ourselves to blame. And this is what I have been arguing, not just for the last 12 months, I've been making these arguments for the last 12 years and got very few thanks for making these arguments. But now, maybe now, as people see the consequences of the pusillanimous policies of Europe and of this presidency in the United States, they will see the dangers of going down the route of the 1930s, because they are now very real to the people of the Ukraine.
All right. Well, Joschka, do you want to pick up on, I think, let's leave aside the Budapest agreement, because obviously that does appear to be dead in the water, but this idea that if you're Ukrainian, it makes sense to consider re-nuclearizing your military capability. I mean, what does that sound like?
I think this would be a very bad idea, to be frank, because this would, at the end, be seen, or not only seen, but in effect, a direct attack to the anti-proliferation regime. And we have serious problems with Iran. I hope, cross my fingers, that at the end there will be an agreement. there will be a successful agreement reached within the coming weeks. But there is a real threat to the non-proliferation regime. And if this non-proliferation regime, the global non-proliferation regime, will collapse, it will be devastating for the global security. Therefore, from that point of view, I think it's a bad idea. But we shouldn't have the Budapest Agreement put aside, because Russia's behavior, which made clear that a guarantee as long as you don't have nuclear arms any longer is a dead paper, and everybody understands what would have happened if Ukraine would have kept its nuclear power, its nuclear arms, that you would be in a different situation. This is a very dangerous and bad message for the non-proliferation regime. But again, to everybody, we all depend on the non-proliferation regime. If this will collapse, one of the key pillars of global security will collapse. There should be no wrong ideas about that. This is far beyond Ukraine. Therefore, I think your president this morning had the right approach. I don't see a success in military terms. I agree that the Europeans must wake up and must invest more in their own security and capabilities. I agree to that. But it's not the solution. It's a kind of deterrence. And I agree that weakness invites aggression and does not deter aggression. Well, that's the big problem.
All right,
what we have seen. But forget about a military solution. Think about a political solution. That's the only way forward.
And on that note, having really enjoyed this sort of rumination on friends, enemies, alliances.
Steve,
yeah.
Can I end on a good note?
Oh, please, yeah, please.
Yeah,
go on.
That's a little Chinese, okay? Answer the lady's question about smaller guys, what to do.
Yeah.
Ukraine's not that small, but I understand what you mean. I'm a small guy. I live okay. I'm able to be the biggest single donor to his university, so I'm doing okay. Small guys have to realize, number one, that you have to be very careful. When you pick sides, the best thing is don't have to pick sides. If you have to pick sides, it's a very dangerous thing. I know what you think, but
yeah, well,
right?
Let Ronnie finish, and then we can all think about it over coffee.
If you are sure that one side is going to protect you to the nth degree, sure, pick sides. If not, then I suggest that you think twice. Is America a trustworthy big brother? Is EU a trustworthy big brother? That's something that you have to figure out yourself. And so small guys like me, the best thing is, if possible, don't pick sides unless you're 100% sure that by picking sides, you'll be safe.
Right. Well, you know what? I'm going to have to draw a close there because we're over time again. But it's an interesting way to finish. And Ronnie, I thank you for that intervention because it's a thought to take away with you. Is it wise for Ukraine? And Ukraine is not a small country. Let's not forget. Ukraine is a really rather large country.
10 times the size of Scotland.
Thank you. Not everything has to be related to Scotland, but I can see why you're doing it today. But anyway,
small province of China.
Ukraine is not a small country. It is a very large country. But even for Ukraine, in its geopolitical place in the world, is it wise to pick sides? That there's maybe a thought to take away from this fascinating discussion.